I am fascinated by what the Buffalo Bills can do at the tight end position during the 2023 NFL Draft. So we're examining the current situation and what prospects the Bills could target to evolve the offense today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome to our everydayers. You know who you are, those of you who never miss a single episode. I appreciate you being here very much. Please also be sure to follow for free or subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, folks, we're talking tight ends on the podcast today. And this conversation absolutely fascinates me because I'm very interested in the Bills adding a tight end potentially in the first 3 rounds, but I also have a lot of questions about it. And so in this opening segment, I want to talk about this current situation and why it intrigues me and why I have some reservations about it. But then I want to talk about the prospects. And I've got 6 prospects that I think would make great Buffalo Bills in the first 3 rounds of the draft. I have a couple of 4th-round options that I want to mention as well. But the bottom line here is there is an opportunity for the Bills to do something at tight end. This is a really, really, really good tight end class. One of the best I've seen. So let's talk about how the Bills can participate in it if they so choose. So what's the current situation? Well, the Bills got Dawson Knox. He'll be entering the first year of his 4-year extension this season. The tight end 2 currently is Quintin Morris. He held the job all of last year, UDFA a few years back out of Bowling Green. Wound up being the tight end 2 last year. And then behind Quintin Morris right now is Zach Davidson, who spent last year on the practice squad. A pretty intriguing young player, but hasn't proven anything and came out of college very, very raw. The Bills no longer have Tommy Sweeney, who is now a member of the New York Giants. So when you look at that depth chart, it's pretty clear that beyond Dawson Knox, it's very upgradable. I think Quintin Morris is a fine player, a good depth player, helped the Bills on special teams, has some receiving upside. But I think he's more of a tight end 3. And at a minimum, if he's your tight end 2, he needs competition. And so just like we talked about with offensive tackle and Spencer Brown, and you look at areas on the offense where the Bills could really upgrade, tight end 2 stands out a lot to me. And so that is part of what makes it intriguing, is I feel like you can get better here. Now, the other layer of this conversation, probably the most important layer of this conversation, is the idea that the Bills could actually run more 12 personnel or 2 tight end sets, having multiple tight ends on the field. I think there's a possibility that could happen. And so obviously having a more intriguing option potentially inspires Ken Dorsey to lean into more 2 tight end sets. And one thing that I talked about last offseason that I think my process was good, but it didn't wind up working out, and I think it's because O.J. Howard didn't end up working out, is that I was under the belief last year that the tight end utilization would uptick. And something that I keep coming back to is when I try to understand the Bills' vision, I always go back to the elements that were in place with the Carolina Panthers when Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane were there together from 2011 through 2016 before taking over in Buffalo. I think it's just natural for any coach, any GM, to look at the situation that they were in, that they probably had success with, and want to replicate a lot of that to their new spot. And you've seen that happen in a lot of different ways with the Bills. But I go back to that 2011 Panthers offense that featured Mike Shula, who's now an offensive assistant with the Buffalo Bills. But when he was there running that offense, they had the tight end duo of Greg Olsen and Jeremy Shockey. Those are two very good tight ends. In that year in 2011, the Panthers tight ends accounted for 85 receptions, 1,008 yards, which is a lot of production. That's a lot more production than the Bills have been getting from their tight ends. You go back to that 2011 season, Greg Olsen, Jeremy Shockey, they accounted for 151 targets, which was 30% of the Panthers' passing attempts. 30%. By comparison, the Bills last year in 2022, the Bills tight ends accounted for 14% of the market share in the Bills offense. In 2021, it was 13%. And in 2020, it was 12%. So it doesn't come close. It's roughly half of what that 2011 Panthers team did when they had Olsen and Shockey. And there's a big part of me that believes Sean McDermott likes tight ends. And he made a comment at the NFL Scouting Combine a few years ago that I've never been able to let escape my mind. And it was about, he actually said, hey, when I was in Carolina and it was a third down, I never panicked because I knew that we had Greg Olsen. I knew that he was going to get open, and I knew that we were going to get a first down. Now, obviously, Greg Olsen, one of the better tight ends of the last 10, 15 years, that certainly gives you a lot of hope for those types of situations, right? Not everybody's fortunate to have a tight end like Greg Olsen. But there's certainly an opportunity for the Bills to get tight ends going more. And I thought last year was going to be the year that they really had a big uptick in market share. I remember predicting the Bills tight ends to have over a 20% market share. But again, I think that had a lot more to do with O.J. Howard not panning out than anything. I think they wanted to do it, but O.J. Howard didn't prove himself in a way that made sense for the Bills to really lean into it. And so not only did they not lean into it, I mean, they rostered Quentin Morris and Tommy Sweeney as the depth players behind Dawson Knox. Let's talk a little bit more about the Bills and tight end market share and opportunity. Last year, the Bills tight end in 2022 was Quentin Morris. He had 8 receptions on 11 targets for 84 yards and a touchdown. Played 30% of the offensive snaps. In 2021, it was Tommy Sweeney as the Bills tight end too. He had 9 catches on 12 targets, 44 yards and a touchdown, and played 30% of the snaps. In 2020, the Bills tight end 2 was Tyler Kraft. Had 12 receptions on 16 targets, 119 yards, 3 touchdowns, and played 45% of the Bills' offensive snaps. But Dawson Knox missed 4 games that year, and I think that led to a bump for Tyler Kraft compared to that 30% mark that we saw in 2021 and 2022. That's not a lot of production, folks. If the Bills used an early pick, first or second round pick on a tight end, and they came in and had similar production, 10 catches, 100 yards, a touchdown, I don't think people are going to be happy about that. When you look at the Bills' tight end receptions in total, including Dawson Knox, over the last 3 seasons compared to the rest of the NFL, it's very, very low. Last year, the Bills' tight ends caught 65 passes. That was 25th in the NFL. In 2021, they caught 61 passes. That was 29th in the NFL. In 2020, they caught 42 passes. That was 30th in the NFL. The bottom line here is that the Bills over the last 3 years haven't gotten tight ends going in the passing game, and their backup tight end plays about 30% of the offensive snaps. So will the impact be there? That's the question that I have. Now, if you're going to embrace 12 personnel and this is going to be a priority for you and you're going to really do this, well, then you can see the path forward and you can feel good about the scheme evolution and how this player could impact the offense. But not if it's more of the same. You can't make an early round investment on a tight end if it's more of the same. You're not drafting a player in the first 3 rounds to play 30% of your snaps, catch 10 passes. Not when you're already paying Dawson Knox $14 million a year for the next 4 seasons. So the idea absolutely fascinates me. But the Bills have struggled to get Dawson Knox the football with any level of consistency. And so I ask myself the question, does it make sense to prioritize tight end 2 over defensive tackle or linebacker or edge rusher or wide receiver or offensive tackle? If you feel like this is the new wrinkle to your offense that you really want to incorporate, all right, I can be sold. But you can't go out there and make this early round pick on a tight end for them to play 30% of the snaps and catch 10 passes. Because next year at this time, if that's the case, we're going to be having big discussions about that resource allocation, what the path forward is, can they evolve? And we've talked about tight ends. It's typically a pretty slow developing position. And the point that I always make there is when you come into the NFL to play tight end, you got to learn how to play offensive line and wide receiver. It's a lot. You're blocking in line. You're blocking detached from the formation. You're playing in the backfield. You're running routes from so many different alignments. There's a lot there, and tight ends are typically very slow developing to the next level. And so all of that is in my mind as we consider the Bills using an early round pick on a tight end. Now, the Bills have been doing a lot of work on these tight ends, whether it's at the combine, bringing them in for 30 visits. They're talking to these top prospects. There's a lot of indicators out there that this could happen. And that's why we're talking about it today. And so hopefully this introductory segment was helpful in you at least understanding the way that I'm envisioning this, where, hey, I can be really sold on this. I'm intrigued. I like the possibility. But at the same time, I have the question about, will there really be scheme evolution? Will the impact really be there? Will the Bills actually get the tight ends going more in the passing game? I guess we'll find out. And so we're going to talk about the prospects here in just a moment. I got 6 of them ranked that I want to dig into. But first, I need to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back. And there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up, place your first bet, and get $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. So maybe you want to bet on Aaron Judge to hit a home run in a game or a pitcher to go over on the projected strikeouts. You can also build a single-game parlay with your favorite matchup of the day. And we know that baseball is all week, every day, tons of games to pick from. So don't miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Let's talk about these prospects. Spent some time in the tape evaluating these players through the lens of the Buffalo Bills. Always a very important thing for me to distinguish when I talk prospects is that I'm talking about how they fit with the Buffalo Bills and ranking them in that order. And so I've got 2 pretty clear tiers in my opinion. I got 3 guys that I like as potential first rounders or trade back and potentially, excuse me, if you're fortunate, get them high second round. And then I have this group of prospects that I think pick 59 later in the second round makes a lot of sense, or maybe even a slight move back, third round type players, and then a couple of fourth round guys that I want to talk about. My #1 tight end for the Buffalo Bills in this draft is Darnell Washington out of Georgia. 6 foot, 6 5/8, 264 pounds, 34 3/8 inch arms, an RAS score of a 988. This guy's different. This is a dude. Got all the size and length and athleticism you could want. Really, really like this player, especially when I think about the Bills leaning into more 12 personnel, having Darnell Washington as a true inline player, what he can mean as a blocker, what he can mean as a middle of the field receiver, and what he can mean for freeing up Dawson Knox to do more in the slot and more even out of the backfield. I think his ability to come in and solidify all that you could want in line and how that frees up Dawson Knox, that's what really intrigues me about Darnell Washington. I really love the skill set here. This guy is a dominant blocker. He blocks like you would want a 265-pound tight end to block. So right off the bat, you're going to be more physical up front, and you're going to be able to create a whole lot more displacement in the run game. And I think about the Bills and wanting to be able to run more to the perimeter, which is pretty obvious when you have James Cook as your lead back. You want to get him going to the perimeter. Darnell Washington is going to help you win the perimeter as a blocker, play side. That intrigues me a ton. Will be a major asset in pass pro, but also that middle of the field target. So whether that's really stressing the seam and pushing the intermediate area of the middle of the field with that size and that athleticism and that length, or it's making himself available in zone, which I think he does a very good job of, reading zone coverage, making himself available, and presenting a huge target for the quarterback. I like him. I like him a ton. And I'll be honest with you, I think he's got some build-up tendencies in terms of his athleticism. It's not super quick twitch, but he's still a threat after the catch. I mean, this guy gets rumbling. You see him hurdling dudes. You see him taking on people with physicality. There's just so much to like here. And he's that guy that I feel like can really be that true inline guy to free up Dawson Knox. There's so much that he can bring to your offense. I think the totality of what he could bring to the offense is unmatched by any of the other of these tight ends. And I like a lot of these other tight ends. But none of them are like Darnell Washington. The only downside to Darnell Washington is that he wore number 0 in college, and Nyheim Hines just claimed number 0 for the Bills. And so he wouldn't be the first number 0 to be Nyheim Hines, unless some type of arrangements worked out. But I'm a big fan, especially for the Bills. So he's my number 1 tight end. My number 2 tight end is a very, very different player, and that's Dalton Kincaid out of Utah. 6'3" 5/8", 246 pounds, 32 5/8 inch arms. We don't have an RAS score for him because he's actually working back from injury right now. I said that the totality of Darnell Washington's skill set is unmatched by any other tight end in this class for the Bills. But the receiving ability specifically that Dalton Kincaid brings to the table is unmatched by all these other tight ends. Dalton Kincaid is a very exciting receiving tight end. Only played 1 year of high school football, went to San Diego initially to play college ball, transferred up to Utah, and has been really productive for the Utes. And that's part of what I really like about Dalton Kincaid is the receiving profile is outstanding. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but the way that Utah utilizes their tight ends is very much translatable to the NFL. And so you think about being able to come in and make an impact for a team and slow developing tight ends. I think him coming from Utah allows him to get ahead of the curve there, because so much of what Utah does offensively translates to the league. But like I said here, the receiving ability is unmatched. I mean, his hands, his ball skills are incredible. I mean, we loosely use the phrase catches everything. Dalton Kincaid catches everything. Love, just a very natural guy in terms of establishing himself at the catch point, winning the football, strong, confident hands. And I love the way he runs routes. A very, very good route runner. Gets in and out of breaks very fluidly. Love the way he carries speed. Really solid player. Now, with Kincaid, you're not getting a very dynamic blocker. You're getting a guy that has good effort, but he's a whole lot more of a get in the way type blocker than he is somebody who's going to really create movement for you. And so that's a slight turnoff with Dalton Kincaid because I feel like I want the Bills tight end to have that ability. But the receiving skills here are impossible for me to rank him any lower than 2. And so if the Bills really wanted to get the tight ends going in the passing game specifically, Kincaid's a guy that's going to elevate any NFL passing game, including the Bills. And number 3, Michael Mayer, Notre Dame. 6'4.5", 249 pounds, 31 5/8 arms. You certainly wish those were longer. And then his RAS score is pretty average at a 7.65. Michael Mayer is one of those guys that you just say he's a football player. Love the way he plays the game. There's a competitive toughness. There's a demeanor. There's a temperament about the way he executes everything he does on the field that I love. I think he's a very, very high floor player. Maybe he's never going to become one of the best tight ends in the league, but if this guy isn't a quality starter for a long time, I'd be shocked. I like him as a blocker. I like him as a receiver. I think he's got above average skills across the board. And the mentality that he plays with is really kind of his trump card that, hey, this guy does everything well, and he's a dude on the field. Loved his involvement for Notre Dame. He's been very productive. Love the way he attacks the football. Love the way he competes with the ball in his hands, the way he gets after people as a blocker. Now, he does lack length. There's no question, and that's going to make for some challenges as a blocker and at the catch point. And one thing that I really value in football players is length. And so that was a bit of a turnoff. The ordinary athletic profile certainly moved him below Washington and Kincaid for me. But as a tight end too, I'd love him. Now, here's the deal. The value here might be tricky. Because if you want him, you probably got to pick him in the first round. And that leads me to all those other questions. And the same is true for Kincaid or Washington. But Mayer's so solid. That's what I'll say about him. So solid. You wish he was a little more explosive. You wish you had a little bit more length. But you love the way he plays, and you love the way it translates. And I think he's going to be a really, really strong pro. So those are my top 3 guys. Darnell, Washington, Georgia, Dalton, Kincaid, Utah, Michael Mayer, Notre Dame. In just a moment, I'm going to get to my next 3 that I would pick in the first 3 rounds, a couple of 4th-round options, and talk about what we're going to do here the rest of the week right after a quick break. All right, my next 3 guys. And so this is a little bit of a tier breaker. So those top 3 were kind of in their own class, and now we got a little bit of a drop-off in talent, but these are all guys that I'm comfortable with, end of second round type range. So my number 4 tight end is Tucker Kraft out of South Dakota State. 6'4 and 6/8, 254 pounds, 32 3/4 arms, an RAS score of 9.68. You watch Tucker Kraft play at South Dakota State, you are watching a man amongst boys. Whether he's blocking, he's just pushing people around. He's running routes. He can win with physicality. The way that he won with the ball in his hands, guys didn't want to deal with him. Had the ability to pull away from coverage vertically. This guy, I wouldn't call him a sleeper because I think most people expect him to go in the second round. But for small school prospects, he's one of the best in the class. Coming from the FCS level. Now, he's going to have to level up here in competition, obviously, and play against far better football players than he did in the past. And I get a little bit nervous about that because guys like Tucker Kraft, and it shows up on tape, he's just bigger, stronger, and faster than the guys he was going up against. And so he'll have to lean a little bit more into technique in the NFL to win. But high character guy. People from the program rave about him, the type of guy that he is. The physical skills are really exciting. The way he dominated was really exciting. Just needs to level up and prove it. But I think that ability to play in line is something like what you would get from Darnell Washington. That's probably a good take. He's probably the FCS version of Tucker Kraft. Or excuse me, the FCS version of Darnell Washington. Now, obviously, that's a lot different, right? Dominating at Georgia in the SEC is different than dominating the FCS level. But I would not be mad if he was the Bills' second-round pick, I'll tell you that. Really intrigues me. Number 5 for me is Sam Laporta of Iowa. 6'3" and 2/8, so a quarter. 245 pounds, 32 and an eighth inch arms, RAS score of a 902. Really like Sam Laporta. You wish he was a little longer. You wish maybe he had a little bit more mass to him. But he's one of those guys that's just a good football player too. If you've watched Iowa over the last 2 seasons play offense, it is tough to watch. Really tough to watch. But Sam Laporta was their guy. And he made a lot of plays with just awful quarterback play and just a unit that couldn't score points. Sam Laporta was a bright spot. Love the way he plays the game. I think he's got really intriguing receiving skill. Route running is pretty solid. Hands are pretty solid. Gets after people in the run game in terms of blocking. I think you can put him in a number of alignments and get production out of him as a blocker and a receiver. I'm not sure he has a super high ceiling, but I think he can be a really outstanding pro. The kind of guy that profiles as a starter. But for the Bills, obviously, we're talking about tight end too. And so in that complementary role, I think he makes a lot of sense. And my number 6 tight end, the last guy that I would personally draft in the first 3 rounds, is Luke Musgrave out of Oregon State. 6'5" and 7/8, 253 pounds, 32 and 5/8 on the arms, RAS score of a 978. Luke Musgrave physically is slapped together real well. Had a chance to spend some time around him at the Senior Bowl. And the body type really checks out. He's a good dude. Really enjoyed talking football with him. Like the way he carried himself and talked about his time at Oregon State and why he loves football, all those types of things. Has a lot to prove in my mind. Missed a lot of time his last season. Modest production throughout his career, but the flashes are really intriguing. He's got a ton of production down the field. If you're looking for that vertical receiving threat at tight end, I mean, Luke Musgrave's probably the most intriguing for that specific area of his game. A lot of big plays, or at least in proportion to the amount of plays he made, a lot of them were down the field. I didn't love him as a blocker. For a guy that's 253 pounds, 6'5", he got pushed into gaps a little bit more than I would like to see. A lot of guys just out leveraging him, getting hands on and squeezing him into gaps and making run lanes go away. Wanted to see a lot more there. But I think he's got a really high ceiling as a receiver. But the turnoff to me is I think what I'm really going to value for the Bills in adding a tight end too with an early round pick is I'm going to value that inline ability as a blocker. And I feel like Musgrave is lacking in that department. I think there's a nice developmental appeal here. I think he can get better. But I think he's coming in potentially the furthest behind any of the players I've mentioned. And so that's why I think he's my 6th tight end and more of a 3rd round type option for me. He might go a lot higher than that, but I'm talking about the way I see these prospects. So those are the guys I would pick in the first 3 rounds. That's really what I'm focusing in on with these positional primers. Darnell Washington 1, Dalton Kincaid, Utah 2, Michael Mayer, Notre Dame 3, number 4 is Tucker Kraft, South Dakota State. Number 5, Sam Laporta from Iowa. Number 6, Luke Musgrave from Oregon State. There's a couple of guys that I like in the 4th round. Luke Schoonmaker out of Michigan. I think there's a lot of appeal there. He's a little bit older. He'll be a 25-year-old rookie. But in terms of, okay, we accomplished what we need here with adding a more meaningful tight end to that can play in line, has baseline receiving skill, had his best season this past year at Michigan after they had some injuries at the position, really kind of emerged. Really nice athletic profile. If you wanted to wait and not get one of these 6 guys that I mentioned, Schoonmaker in the 4th round still accomplishes a lot of the objectives that I talked about with the Bills embracing more 12 personnel. The other guy is Davis Allen out of Clemson, who I think can be an impact blocker. I love his body control as a receiver. I just don't know that he has a very high ceiling, not quite athletically as gifted as some of these other players we've talked about. But like I said, 4th round, a legitimate tight end to complement to Dawson Knox, not really asking them to be a huge factor in your offense, kind of that 30% of the time, going to catch 10, 11, 12 passes, that type of role. Davis Allen makes a lot of sense to me. And there's a ceiling for him to develop into that is also appealing. So those are my 4th round options. I like other tight ends, but I really focused on guys that I think could come in and be a legit tight end too for the Bills. Bretton Strange out of Penn State, I like him, but lacks length, more of a move piece tight end. The Old Dominion kid, Zach Kuntz, I mean, intriguing, but really raw. I wasn't really focusing on those guys. I'm looking for a legit scheme evolution, legit complement to Dawson Knox. And those 6 that I mentioned are the ones that can really do that. And then if you're looking for the tight end too, that's kind of been the tight end too for the Bills. Luke Schoonmaker, Davis Allen makes sense to me. But also I think they have a little more ceiling than what the Bills have had at tight end too over the last few years. So there you have it. The tight end conversation as it relates to the Bills and the 2023 NFL Draft. Still want to get into edge for one of these positional primers. Want to talk some of the interior offensive line, some running backs, safeties as well a little bit. So we'll get to that the rest of the week. You guys have been sending in some awesome herd mentality items, and I know that I did that on Friday, but we might need to sneak in an episode of that very soon. The Bills signed A.J. Klein back, so we need to talk about that in the very near future. So a lot to get into here on the podcast. So a good time to make sure that you're subscribed. And of course, I would love it if you took a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.